Welcome into Mock Trial Masterclass, your guide to controlling the courtroom. I'm Luke and I want you to be a mock trial master. Let's talk about how you can make that happen. If you've ever dug into the rules of evidence before, you know that they can seem a little bit complicated and a little bit tricky. Well, in this video, we're going to go into one of the rules of evidence that probably on the surface seems the most tricky. We're going to be talking about Rule 403 in this video, but don't let that force you to run away and click out of your window if you're watching this on a laptop, right? Because here's what I'm going to promise you as we do this breakdown of Rule 403. It's going to make a whole lot more sense to you in about 10 minutes than it does right now. We're going to go super slow. We're going to take it step by step. And if there's ever a part where you're not quite sure, you don't think you got it, rewind that part, go back to the beginning. I promise I'm going to guide you to where you need to go. I'm going to explain Rule 403 to you the exact same way I explain it to my students that I coach here in Tennessee, to the students that I get to coach all across the country on Zoom calls and in the coaching that I offer at the link in the description. And we're going to get through this and you're going to understand Rule 403. I promise you that. So, are you ready to hop into Rule 403 and learning everything there is to know about this rule that seems complicated, but maybe isn't quite so complicated? Let's hop in. So the best place for us to start as we break down Rule 403 is with Rule 403. Let's read through the rule together. Take a look. The court may exclude relevant evidence if its probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of one or more of the following: unfair prejudice, confusing the issues, misleading the jury, undue delay, wasting time, or needlessly presenting cumulative evidence. So that list at the end is very long, and a lot of that can be very important, but what I want us to focus on just for right now is that first phrase, unfair prejudice, or the danger of unfair prejudice. We can worry about the rest of them some other time, but we're going to be concerned about unfair prejudice in the context of Rule 403 in this video as you try to wrap your mind around the rule and what it means. So let's now dive into breaking down some of the terms we saw in that rule, which was a little bit like alphabet soup. Let's be realistic. We're going to start by breaking down the first term you saw, relevant evidence, right? The rule started by saying that the court may exclude relevant evidence, ... And what that tells us right out of the gate is that Rule 403 deals with evidence that is relevant. Now, if you're not sure what relevance means, you can go check out my video that breaks down relevance and Rule 401. But if you do know what relevance means, you know that relevant evidence is evidence that has any tendency to make a fact or consequence more or less likely. So that's the type of evidence that we're dealing with when we make Rule 403 objections, because the rule tells us right off the bat that this is relevant evidence. The next term I want to look at is probative value. If you've read my book, you know that I talk about how relevance is a binary concept. There's no such thing as one piece of evidence being more relevant than another. That's because something is either relevant or it's not relevant. There's no such thing as a degree of relevancy. It either is or it isn't. With probative value, though, which is the term we're looking at right now, there are degrees. See, while the term relevance tends to ask with a piece of evidence, could this be useful, right? Does it have a tendency to make a fact of consequence more or less likely? The term probative value asks, how useful is it? See, probative value is a measure of the usefulness of evidence. When we're saying, what is the probative value of this piece of evidence? We're saying, how is it useful and how useful is it? So, Rule 403 says relevant evidence, evidence that is relevant, may be excluded, in other words, may not be allowed, if its probative value, in other words, if its usefulness, if how useful it is. The next term we're going to look at is substantially outweighed. Now, this is a term I don't have to explain to you. You know what substantially outweighed means. You know that an elephant substantially outweighs a brand new puppy dog. You know that a giant piece of living room furniture outweighs your smartphone, substantially so, right? So substantially outweighs means, number one, it outweighs something. There's a big weight difference, but it's not just a weight difference. It's a huge weight difference. It's a substantial weight difference. So let's go back to the rule. Relevant evidence, evidence that's relevant, may be excluded if its probative value, in other words, its usefulness, is substantially outweighed, in other words, it's not even close on a scale, by the danger of unfair prejudice. So let's talk about that term, danger of unfair prejudice. Now, what you need to know at first is that every piece of evidence that gets presented in a trial has prejudice and has a prejudicial effect, if you will, on the jury. Right? If I'm trying a murder case and I present evidence to the jury that the defendant owned the murder weapon, that the murder weapon belonged to the defendant, okay, well, that evidence is going to prejudice or persuade the jury into thinking the defendant is guilty. Right? But if I were prosecuting my case, that would be my job. It would be my job to present that kind of prejudice to the jury. The problem becomes if we're using prejudice that's not fair or that's out of line. In other words, prejudice that's a little bit slimy. So there's a natural question that follows from that, which is, how do we know what type of prejudice is fair and which type of prejudice is not fair? Very simple answer to that question. A piece of prejudice or prejudicial evidence is fair if it's going to persuade the jury on the basis of facts. Right, so that example I just gave, the defendant owned the murder weapon. That is a potential fact I could present, and upon hearing that fact, the jury would find it more likely that the defendant committed the murder, right? We're dealing entirely with facts. But what if I started to present evidence that wasn't based in fact so much, it wasn't going to get the jury to consider a fact, but maybe instead was going to get them to consider their emotions? What if I started to point out bad things about the defendant? What if I just started hurling out evidence to prejudice the jury and to just not liking the guy? And as a result, they go to the deliberation room at the end of the trial, and they're talking and they're saying, well, the facts of the case don't really point to the fact that he did it, but man, he just seems so slimy and I didn't like him, so let's convict him. Is that how our justice system in America works? Right? No, obviously not. Right? We want juries making factual decisions, and that's why this Rule 403 exists. See, the type of prejudice we just talked about, where we're having a jury consider things not based on facts, a fact like he owned the murder weapon, but an emotion like I don't like him, I don't feel good about him, that's unfair prejudice. Unfair prejudice is any type of evidence that gets a jury to consider the case on a non-factual basis. We want a jury to be completely engaged in the facts of the case, not in how it makes them feel, and not in how the people involved in the case make them feel. And that, again, is why Rule 403 exists. But don't think at this point, as we've just discussed this, that Rule 403 excludes any evidence that might make a jury make an emotional decision, because that's not entirely true. We've talked about more components of the rule than just that. So let's go back to the rule as a whole and then re-break it down now that we know what some of these terms mean. Relevant evidence may be excluded if its probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of unfair prejudice. So, again, we have evidence that is relevant, but that evidence, even though it's relevant, is not going to be allowed if its usefulness, its probative value, how useful it is substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice. In other words, the danger of causing the jury to evaluate the case on a non-factual basis. Rule 403 at the end of the day, guys, is a balancing test. I love whenever I'm teaching Rule 403 to my students to write something like this on the marker board, which is a scale. It's balancing the probative value or usefulness on one hand, and then on the other hand, the danger of unfair prejudice, the danger of having the jury consider the case on a non-factual basis on the other hand. And what you're doing when you make a Rule 403 objection is you're weighing those two things. You're balancing those two things, and you're seeing what's the balance there. Is the usefulness substantially outweighed by the danger this evidence has to make the jury evaluate the case on a non-factual basis? So let's think of a couple examples, right? So maybe we're in a murder trial, just because that's a really simple example to follow mentally. And we as the prosecution are presenting pictures of a bloody, maimed, dead body. Okay, now as the prosecution, one of our responsibilities in a murder trial is obviously to prove that someone died, right? You can't have a murder unless someone died. So we're just showing the court these pictures of a dead body to check that box, say, hey, yeah, someone died. We got to prove that. So it's relevant, right? It hits that bar, but remember with Rule 403, we're dealing with relevant evidence, so that doesn't matter. The question we're going to ask is, number one, how useful is it? What's the probative value? That's the one thing we're going to weigh. And then the other question we're going to ask, the other thing we're going to look at is, what's the danger it has to unfairly prejudice the jury, to force the jury to make a decision on a non-factual basis? So our probative value in the case of these pictures of a maimed, bloody, dead body is, okay, we as the prosecution have to prove that someone died. That's our probative value. Now, there are probably a lot of ways we could prove that. We could prove that someone died simply by having a witness testify to that fact. We could prove that with a death certificate that doesn't involve any bloody pictures. And so as the defense, they might make a Rule 403 objection and say, Your Honor, we realize that there is relevance to this and there is some probative value, but it's very little because there's a number of other ways they could prove this. And then on the other hand, what's going to substantially outweigh that is the danger it has to inflame the emotions of the jury and get them to ignore the facts and just make a decision based on their feelings. I mean, think about it. If you're sitting in a jury in real life and you start to see pictures of a bloody, maimed, dead body, that's going to make you feel a certain way, right? It's going to get a rise in you. You're not going to like that. You're probably going to get angry about that, about the fact that this person in this case died in that way. But as Americans, as a society, with this justice system we have, we don't want juries going to deliberate cases in an emotional state or an angry state. And so that type of evidence, pictures of bloody, maimed, dead bodies, is exactly the type of evidence that Rule 403 is designed to keep out. Because without Rule 403, it's coming in. It is relevant, right? We proved that very small barrier, that somewhat of a probative value that it has. But I think you would agree with me that in this situation, that limited probative value, in other words, its limited usefulness to the trial, is substantially outweighed by the danger it's going to have to unfairly prejudice the jury, to get them to consider this case on an emotional basis instead of a factual basis. And that's what this rule is all about. Rule 403 asks, is the probative value, the usefulness of the evidence, substantially outweighed by the danger it has to be unfairly prejudicial? And if the answer to that is yes, then the evidence is not coming in. Now, there's a lot more we could get into about arguing Rule 403 well and some traps to avoid when you're making 403 objections, and we'll cover that in a later video down the road. But for right now, I just want you to focus on understanding what the rule means. If you're still a little bit lost, if there's still some cobwebs, don't worry, it's very complicated. Go back to the start of the video, watch it again. It's just, 10, 15 minutes long. You have the time in your day to do that. And really dig into this rule, because I promise if you spend some time with it, you will understand it. Another thing I would recommend is picking up a copy of my book, Mock Trial Masterclass, not because I just want to sell a book, but because there's an entire section in this book devoted to not just Rule 403, but every one of the major rules of evidence. And so if seeing it in this form has made you say, okay, I'm kind of getting there, I'm kind of understanding it, maybe seeing it in another form like this book will help you get all the way there. And if you want to pick up a copy, you can do that by clicking the link in the description on YouTube or in the show notes on podcast platforms. But I know you can understand Rule 403. When I competed, had the hardest time grasping this rule, and I eventually got there, and I know that you can and will too.